We're here today with Mark Feldmeir. Mark's the author of 4 books, including his latest work, A House Divided, Engaging the Issues Through Politics of Compassion. And we're going to dive into that book quite a bit and talk about it more. It's a really phenomenal book, so I highly recommend it. Mark has served on the adjunct faculty at Claremont School of Theology, where he's taught homiletics and has spoken at various conferences throughout the country on topics ranging from preaching, politics, and pop culture. He currently serves as the lead pastor at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. Mark, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us, and I really appreciate you including us in your book launch.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's great to be with you today.
So I do want to mention that this is the book, A House Divided, coming out from Chalice Press. And what's the release date for it, Mark?
It releases on Amazon September 8th. In fact, it's now available, I understand, through Chalice Press as of late last week.
Okay, and I'm sure you can pre-order it several different places too. So, you know, the story of how this book came about was pretty interesting. I mean, from some sermons that you did. Can you tell us a little bit about what led up to the creation of that sermon series and then the creation of the book?
Well, I typically plan out my sermons months in advance. I give the preaching plan to my entire staff, and they can plan out their work to sort of coincide with what we're doing in worship. And so months in advance, I planned this 8-part series on the controversial issues that are dividing America. And I like to plan these more controversial or provocative sermon series right after either Easter or right after Christmas, when we've got, generally leading into those seasons, a higher number of people coming through, and so hoping to provoke some folks to come back, and it worked. And so we did these eight sessions around the controversial issues of our day, based on what some of the national polls were indicating were the most controversial or decisive issues for Americans as they go to the polls and as they vote. And it just so happened that we had planned to start with immigration, and not really knowing when I planned this months in advance that on the very day that we launched the sermon series with the topic of immigration was also sort of the week in which on the national scene the immigration issue was exploding, with caravans and families being separated at the borders. And so the timing really was somewhat providential, I guess. And that really opened things up. And I think over the course of those 8 weeks, our attendance in worship was up 16 or 17% for that time. So it turned out okay. And that gave me sort of inspiration to put that into a book.
So how did you then go about turning that into a book?
Well, I built out a little bit of what I didn't do originally, and which is only partially included in the book. But I really started doing deeper theological work around what I call the politics of compassion and the 3 core commitments to a politics of compassion. One is this idea of radical kinship that Jesus practiced in his own day. This way of transcending typical forms of table fellowship in the first century Palestine to include not only friends and family, but adversaries and enemies, as well as the friendless and those that were rejected. And so this idea of radical kinship sort of addresses issues of tribalism in our country today, and which team that we're on and which team that we're opposed to. Jesus, again, transcended all that and made everybody at the table family, regardless of their story. And then we describe the second core commitment being kenosis, the Greek word for really a self-pouring out of one's life for the sake of others, described by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Philippians, in which he describes Jesus as the one who didn't exploit his power and privilege as equal with God, but poured that power and privilege out for the sake of others. And so when we think about kenosis, what does it look like in our modern world? as we work for the common good, we develop a willingness, even an eagerness to pour our own privilege for the sake of others who may not have it, for the sake of the common good. And then the third core commitment is delight, which is, for me, one of my favorite words. It just describes how we perceive other people, and in particular how we seek the image of God, or the imago Dei, in the face of all people, not just friends, but enemies and adversaries, and the friendless as well. And that delight, there's a Hebrew word for it that I think it's kaf fates is the Hebrew word, and it speaks of this leaning in toward the other out of curiosity, and or bending toward the other, even the other who is not like you. And so, how do we approach others with endless curiosity, even those that may disagree with us? So I built those sort of core commitments out, and then rewrote those 8 chapters through that particular lens, and shopped it around, and Chalice picked it up. So
Good. Well, I'm really glad they did. As I mentioned before, it's just an outstanding book, very practical, and it's not long, so it doesn't take, a ridiculous amount of time to wade through or anything, but very useful, and I really hope it ends up being a roadmap, a pathway that as a society and a country that we can use to heal and to have some of these conversations. I grew up in a corporate culture where the things that you never talk about were politics, religion, and sex.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm sure a lot of other people were in similar situations that, those are just taboo. And so, politics is one of those things that none of us, at least a lot of us, don't know how to talk about well. So talk about that in a church setting. Why is it so hard for people of faith to discuss politics in church?
Yeah, I can just tell you, historically in the churches that I've served, and particularly in the church I'm in now, which is a large congregation that is also what you described, is described as purple. Folks from both sides of the aisle who truly are committed to politics of compassion, and who live that out, even though they may not be able to name it as such. I think certainly when I kicked off that sermon series in the first quarter of 2019, I had many people who came to me and said, I may not come to church because I just don't want to mix my politics and my faith. And I challenged them and said, over and over again, Jesus connected politics with faith. And even the biblical narrative of the incarnation begins in a highly politically charged context with, as we say on Christmas Eve in the Luke passage, in the days of King Herod when Quirinius was governor of Judea. The Christmas story itself reflects these very tense times in Judea, and in which the incarnation has something to say about politics. We often in church will read the Nicene Creed. It's curious that the only person other than Jesus and Mary who is mentioned in the creed is Pontius Pilate, a political leader. And the Nicene Creed, once it gets to the suffered under Pontius Pilate, that creed unfolds in such a way that it reverses the power narrative of Pilate, so that by the end of that creed, the resurrection is the antidote to the violence of the world. And so Christianity has for centuries had this posture that is necessarily political, that deals with real human needs. Jesus makes it clear that in Matthew 25, when it comes time to take in the final exam, so to speak, Jesus is not going to ask us how we voted, but he is going to ask us how we acted politically in the world. When you saw the hungry, did you feed them? When you saw the naked, did you clothe them? These are highly political activities. We don't think of them as political because we think of politics as voting, as these or these other activities that we do in the world to bring about change. but every day we are practicing politics. And so why don't we choose to practice the politics of compassion, which reflects the life of Jesus?
So there are several different controversial topics, as you mentioned, that you cover in this book. And basically what Mark does is he talks about, kind of underlying, hopefully, areas of agreement within each one. But let me kind of read down the list. There's climate change, racism, immigration, healthcare, medical aid in dying, Islamic extremism, homosexuality, social isolation, and suicide. So that's a pretty big waterfront, right? You've really done a great job of, going after a lot of, as you said, controversial topics. As you've experienced your church since you wrote the book and since you did these sermons, which of these areas have you found that the conversations resulting from the axioms have been the most fruitful versus the ones that have been still the most challenging?
I would say racism in particular, and probably in light of the events of the last several months, really beginning with George Floyd death, and that led us into conversations that were far more deeper than even what I've outlined in the chapter on racism in the book, and which led me to sort of learn new ways, even since the writing of that book, to talk about race and structural racism. To help in the book, I really focus on this distinction between the way whites see race and racism and the way blacks see it, and that is to say that whites see race primarily as sort of a perspective of bias and prejudice against people of color, whereas blacks see it precisely as institutionalized or structural prejudice. And so in the book, I try to make that distinction so that people can begin to have these conversations. Since then, we've been able to talk about, about this issue around what does it mean to be an advocate or an ally for people of color? Because, white folks are afraid, A, to talk about race, but B, they're quick to sort of play out this good-bad dichotomy, which says only bad people are racist, and I'm not a bad person, so I can't be racist. Or they'll say I've got plenty of black friends, or they'll say I don't utter racial epithets. But as we've learned, I think just in the last several months, with some very helpful writers, black writers, it's not enough just to be not a racist, but we're truly called to be anti-racist. And to be an anti-racist means that that we're called to be a part of a movement toward dismantling institutionalized racism, to be an advocate and an ally for those who are dealing with this daily in their lives. So that's an example of, I think, of ways that the book helped create a platform for those bigger and more difficult questions to be had. And maybe that wouldn't have happened without that book first.
Good. What about on the other side? What's been tougher? What have you, of those different topics, have you felt like, not really any significant progress?
Well, I think the pandemic has probably brought more of those, some of those issues close to the forefront, and others are less urgent, I would say. So, the pandemic has really brought to our attention the disparities in our healthcare system, for example, and this connection between the healthcare industry trying to turn a profit at the same time of trying to make people well, and those are, in times of pandemic, sometimes incompatible. So that's been more front and center, whereas Islamic extremism hasn't really been part of the national dialogue in several months. In my own denomination, United Methodist Church, the issue of homosexuality, it's been front and center for 50 years, sadly, in this ongoing debate over who's to be included and who's not. and that debate was leading toward what was very clearly to be this last summer a general conference that led to the split between traditionalists and centrists and progressives. And of course, the pandemic interrupted that and postponed that conference until next year. So I think what we're seeing is the pandemic has made some of these issues more relevant and others less urgent. So.
Yeah, no, that's a very natural outcome, given the impact that the pandemic has had to us all. So do you have a favorite chapter in the book? How do you look at it now that you've written it and reflect on it?
Yeah. I think for me, I positioned for the book climate change as the lead chapter in the book, and when I preached the sermon series, that was actually the last sermon of the 8 that I preached, and I think as I reflected on why I wanted that first, I looked at some of the polling nationally, and for millennials today, that's the number one issue, at least prior to the the more urgent racial unrest that we've seen in the last few months. That was a leading issue throughout all the polls. And so as I thought about assembling this book, I thought about my own 3 kids. I've got a 26-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And what's the one chapter that I'd want them, if they're all going to read one chapter, what's the one I'd want them to read? And just actually last week, one of the students here in church who is on our video crew, I gave him a copy of the book at his request, and he told me just last week that he read the whole book and his favorite was the chapter on climate change, because he felt like it was the most pragmatic, as he said, and the most practical in terms of some of the solutions that I provide. So that's one of my favorite chapters. I think it's relevant. It'll be relevant for years to come.
So before this book, you had written at least a couple of others. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, my previous book to this latest book is it's a book on hospitality, which is sort of it's a strange word. And the title is "You Need to Get Out More," and the book really is about how do we practice neighboring in our everyday lives. And the word for hospitality in Greek is philoxenia, which means just literally love of stranger. And it's the antidote to the other xenia that we practice, which is xenophobia, right? Or xenophobia in the Greek, which is fear of stranger. And so in some ways that maybe that was a prelude to this book, in the sense that my argument in the book is that the reason that we are as deeply divided in our country as we are today is because we aren't neighbors. We live socially isolated, disconnected lives that lead to a great deal of unhappiness, but also lead to a great deal of loneliness. Even as I finished the book with the chapter on loneliness and suicide, and so the previous book was really about the need to get out more, to practice neighboring in our own communities, and to love the stranger and the friendless. The previous 2 books before that were books that were more reflective of Generation X and what we might call the postmodern generation that is somewhat apathetic to Christian preaching. And so both of those books were really compilations of thought as well as sermons around how to reach a new generation.
Interesting. Well, that's certainly a very important topic as well.
Yeah.
So where do you see yourself going next from an author perspective?
Well, I'm really, I think, on this trajectory of with the previous book around neighboring and how to live socially connected lives with others, to this book around politics. I'm on that trajectory of what's next is I think further conversations about how to have the hard conversations with each other, how to sit around the table with folks who are of different perspectives and even different traditions, and finding that common ground that truly reflects how Christ in his own day incarnated God's love and presence in the midst of division.
Well, that's really good to hear, because I mean, I think we need a lot of healing in our country. We need a lot of how-to in terms of having conversations that we haven't had well, if at all. And hopefully after the election, there'll be more of those to be had.
I expect that to be so, for sure.
So what advice do you have for authors who are just getting started? You know, the whole process of writing a book, the whole process of getting published, the marketing of the book, you know, things like that.
Yeah. Pay attention, right? Pay attention to your life, to paraphrase Frederick Buechner, listen deeply, and write every day. Every day I write, in part because I have to as a pastor. And, you know, I'm writing 3,000 to 4,000 words a week, and so there's just a way to practice the craft that's natural to what I do, but to be a good writer, you have to love words, and you have to know how to use words and put them together in ways that create meaning for the reader. So pay attention and write. Don't read reviews, and you know, trust your stuff. And this probably is this fourth book of mine is probably the one book that I believe in more than anything I've ever written, and I believe that it's timely. I believe that it's fair and theologically grounded, and I think it has something to speak into the tension and anxiety that we're in as a country. And so, you know, we've heard the phrase, you know, sort of, you know, let it bleed, right? And cut the vein and pour out yourself in ways that are life-giving to the world, and somebody will love it.
Well, let me show the cover again, and you know, say that I highly recommend this book. I really hope that it does well for you, Mark. I hope it's got long legs in terms of its attractiveness, and you know, best of luck as you continue through the book launch.
I'm grateful for that support, Brian, and I'm really pleased to be with you today, and thanks for the exposure.
Well, it's our pleasure. You know, Writing for Your Life is all about writing for your life, you know, and trying to demonstrate examples of really effective work. And so this is certainly one that I want to highlight and make sure people know about. So we will continue to do that.
Great.